So I want to preface my paper with a few things. One, it's called Constraints on Thought and Action, the Democrats and Left Responses to Policing. And it's sort of a mashup of several editorials and a different panel presentation that I gave last year to the Platypus Affiliated Society. You can read all of the editorials at classunity.org, organization that I am a member of. And you can read the transcript of that panel at platypus1917.org as well. I also wanted to say that the paper makes extensive mention and use of anecdotes from my personal experience and observations in the Democratic Socialists of America. And so if it seems a little parochial for that reason, just know that I'm a member of that organization, and these are the things that I see in my daily life, and that's why. All right, so I'm going to get started. Almost a year has now passed since the 2020 street protests over the police murder of George Floyd. Late May and June saw demonstrations of moderate size spread to a huge number of American cities. Now, with the election of Joe Biden, it seems that activity has been subdued, or at least channeled in different directions. The time is always ripe for critical reflection, but perhaps the distance granted to us by the passage of time offers a moment when clarity could be achieved. The events of 2020 caused significant confusion and consternation on the left in general, and within the Democratic Socialists of America in particular, with many assuming that they represented a major and unique opportunity. Popular reactions to George Floyd's murder were extremely scattershot, including vigils, protests, rioting, and looting. None of these held the organizational potential to significantly transform the practices of American policing and incarceration. Despite the almost certain futility of the actions, open questions in regards to events were almost exclusively related to how to support the protests in the immediate, like buying supplies, sending people, and contributing bail funds. These are all perfectly acceptable reactions for private citizens with an interest in justice within capitalist society. But why did they appear as the only matter of importance for DSA members and chapters in that moment? It is because the left is beset by a pathology that sees immediate, unceasing, and unreflective action as the only option for true radicals, and distrusts critical thought in any moment of apparent crisis. Theodor Adorno called this tendency actionism, which, quote, is the mark of a praxis that, having become its own fetish, becomes a barricade to its own goal. The dialectic is hopeless. That through praxis alone is it possible to escape the captivating spell praxis imposes on people, but that meanwhile, as praxis is compulsively contributes to reinforcing the spell, obtuse, narrow-minded, at the farthest removed from spirit. Indeed, critical assessments of the situation at the time were met with overwhelming hostility, including the pejorative utilization of the term intellectuals, an ironic and telling echo of a phenomenon that Adorno himself had noted in his correspondence with Herbert Marcuse in 1969 on the German New Left. Quote, here in Frankfurt, and certainly in Berlin as well, the word professor is used condescendingly to dismiss people, or as they so nicely put it, to put them down. These same students, of course, often entered academia themselves, and today we have a reversed situation. The uncritical acceptance of whatever activist currents on the ground comes from within the university itself. Similar sentiments were present in the early 2000s, see Penwood, Featherstone, and Parenti, and indeed have been continuous presence on the left since they were first identified in the 1960s. In a particularly sharp sign of the times, advertisements for this very conference have been derisively characterized as, quote, a bunch of academics telling you that you should be reading Marx instead of engaging in righteous street conflicts with the police. Since actionism leaves so little time for creative and critical thinking about any event that appears as a crisis, it tends to be the case that various left factions try to claim the crisis as an expression of whatever their demands are. Insurrectionary socialists claimed that the riots were evidence of an impending revolution, or a movement arising due to the failure of electoral socialists and progressives. Socialists more inclined towards constitutionalist approaches to revolution attempted to offer explanations for the violence which placed agency on the police officers in charge of managing the protests. This is all indicative of a typical left posture towards contemporary reality, to look for moments of the expression of discontent, and then to make the claim that these moments indicate the objective advance of one's own project, political or otherwise. If someone at a protest is saying something radical, ignoring for a moment whether the source of their radicalism is political or psychological in nature, then that must mean that the movement, what people in close proximity to them at any given point in time, must hold potential too. What is this radical potential? There's no democracy or authority to be found, so it can be whatever one wants it to be. According to groups within the DSA, people see the systemic nature of police violence and thus are more open to political ideas that seek to change the system. The problem with this kind of formulation is that it avoids the question of the type of political ideas that are seen as providing, quote, systemic change. This is an issue because the established reality precludes neither criticism nor change. On the contrary, insistence on the dynamic character of the status quo, on its constant revolutions, is one of the strongest props of said status quo. One does not really need to resort to critical theorists from the 1960s for these insights. That was a quote from Marcuse. Indeed, it was on display in the last Democratic Party primary, where notable capitalist politicians made, quote, structural change their watchword. In the face of the protests, socialists within DSA abandoned any pretense to the historical specificity of modern police brutality. Instead, they generally acquiesced to the notion that the almost daily tragedies that we witness in America are a simple continuation of what they take to be a foundational principle of American society, racism. According to this analysis, the causative through line from slavery and its associated patrols, convict leasing, segregation, and now mass incarceration and police brutality is the transhistorical category of racism. Or, if they need to account for the almost universal condemnation of such attitudes today, structural racism, institutional racism, aversive racism, colorblind racism, post-racial racism, cultural racism, internalized racism, implicit racial bias, white supremacy, or multiracial whiteness. If socialists make any argument that political economy might be related to the methods and degree of American policing, this is generally at a purely formalistic level and still reliant on the proximal cause of racist attitudes. Common arguments take the form, yes, policing is bad because it's racist, but don't you see, capitalism causes racism. The discursive function of such maneuvers was and is to move the fight against police brutality from the questions of specific institutional forms unique to the American state to a need to address the primordial set of malign attitudes held deeply within all of us, Black, white, or otherwise. With this, socialists sacrificed and continue to sacrifice the centerpieces of what has historically been their critique on the altar of progressive respectability. As Cedric Johnson has demonstrated, the rise of the modern American carceral state mirrors the rise of neoliberalism, and with it the need to cheaply manage a growing reserve army of labor, one that just happens to be as multiracial as the rest of America. As I have noted elsewhere, this sacrifice ends up attacking the very basis of the socialist political project, which is to forge working class unity in opposition to capitalism. Treating demands like the right to live life unmolested by the violent and often arbitrary police state as if they are demands of a specific race papers over the fact of the matter. The police exist to protect the social order of capitalism, and to do this, they must threaten to mete out violence to all those who are ill-served by this social order. Why are socialists so hesitant to raise the issues that they know to be true with the progressive idea that the problem with policing is its unfair application? It is because in their rush to affirm the movement, quote, in the streets, they ignore the subjective factors at play within the, to quote Johnson, facile expressions of unity. These subjective factors all point in one direction, the Democratic Party. Socialists may imagine they can avoid the problem of the most powerful political party on earth by eschewing electoral politics, but when one runs from the party at the ballot box, one finds its cadre, ideologues of the first class trained in the school of middle-brow progressive taste, everywhere. These cadre and the organizations that they lead set the boundaries for what can and cannot be said within the movement, and ultimately tend to direct activity to the extant avenues for exerting minoritarian pressure on the technical administration of society. Pressure campaigns, example, defund/abolish the police, legal battles over things like qualified immunity, and non-governmental organization activity. What kind of thinking can accommodate this subordination of socialists to progressive leadership? Leftists in the DSA adopt a fundamentally pragmatic posture with respect to their own thought. Theory is necessary because developing the kinds of coherent strategy and tactics required to wage struggle with respect to the protests against police brutality requires, quote, theoretically thoughtful organization. In other words, whatever works at the time, do it. Adorno remarked in Marginalia to Theory and Praxis that pragmatism has been criticized, and with good reason, for consecrating the existing conditions by making the practical applicability of knowledge its criterion for knowledge. Supposedly nowhere else could the practical effectiveness of knowledge be tested. If in the end theory, which bears upon the totality, if it does not want to be futile, is tied down to its effectiveness here and now, then the same thing befalls it despite its belief that it escapes the immanence of the system. Theory steals itself back from the system's immanence only where it shirks its pragmatic fetters, no matter how modified they may be. Adorno is noting a seeming necessity of a certain productive distance between thinking and action in the contemporary world. An extremely weak version of this argument, but one that has been borne out over the past year, is that socialist thought must at least not marry itself entirely to the activity of a completely different political group, progressives. As long as socialist theory is used entirely to justify progressive activism, it restrains itself from either freeing socialists from their actionist prison or becoming an independent, coherent body of thought. This necessarily would involve alienating the socialist left from the Democratic Party, but if tailing the progressive wing of capitalist politics was a path to winning socialism, we would have arrived at the goal long ago. Adorno continued in Marginalia. Brecht once said, in effect, that when he was honest with himself, he was more interested in the theater than in changing the world. Such a consciousness would be the best corrective for a theater that today confuses itself with reality, such as the happenings now and then staged by the actionists that muddle aesthetic semblance and reality. Instead of trying to mold the theater into a movement, the left should strike out on its own and make the case that we know to be true. The police patrol the discontents of class society. In order for their excesses to be diminished, the discontents must be pacified through other means. In order for their excesses to be eliminated, class society must be brought to a close. And that's the end. I think I wanted to make one more remark that I forgot at the beginning, which was, despite the fact that the topic of this panel is the left and liberalism, this is really about the left and the Democrats. And I think Ed's talk might have hinted at the question of the relationship between liberalism and the Democrats is itself a extremely fraught and sort of questionable one.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Conrad. Dylan, take it away with your comments whenever you're ready or questions.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that the paper. Well, I looked at the things that were on the Class Unity website a bit, and just tried to pull together some remarks from that and from what you just said here. So I want to say that it strikes me that kind of even just more generally than the whole question of what orientation the DSA should take toward the police protests of last summer, I think that your comments point to a more general question, which is, basically what are the conditions for viable socialist politics in the current period, and does this wave of protests, do they have any relationship to socialism? I think that's the question that you're sort of posing. And I think you're very right to pose that question, and that the skepticism that you register in that regard, I think is well kind of taken. And then in a way, I think it might be good for us to just kind of take off on that and go a bit forward and ask the question, in terms of your demand for a more effective linking together of political activity and theory, what are the things that might be required for a viable socialist politics? And we might just note a couple. And I would say that one of the things that I think is of very, very pressing importance is an actual analysis of the structure of the political economy, particularly the US political economy at this moment in capitalist history. And I really think that this is important because in my kind of view of these things, and this is, as you in part, this is, I think, very much related to the kind of whole style of politics that is unfolding before us. You know, there's been a major shift that's been going on for the last several decades, obviously under the moniker of neoliberalism. But, you know, I would suggest that the shift is actually more profound than that. It is, in a sense, a shift in capitalism away from the search for relative surplus value toward politically determined forms of exploitation and expropriation. And this has gotten more extreme since 2008 and is, in a certain way, a new structure of exploitation that needs to be theorized, and the dynamics of which need to be laid out in order to kind of orient ourselves politically in this new world. And let me just say that I think there are some political phenomena that are associated with this shift. The rise of what I have called elsewhere political capitalism. And what are those phenomena? First, and I think this is something that is very much in much of Conrad's writing as well. We should note that the form of class struggle that we are now engaged in, or that is now unfolding, is entirely different from that of the 30 glorious years and the classical welfare state period, in which the working class, at least in the advanced capitalist world, was engaged in a class struggle over the share of a relatively expanding pie. That is to say, there was a basis, in fact, for social democratic class compromise. This no longer exists. The entire objective basis for that is gone. And that in that sense, social democratic politics, at least of the post-World War II type, its moment is over, and the time for some new form of socialist politics is clearly on the agenda. Second point is that there is a transformation in the sort of phenomenology of classes, which is important to understand. That class struggle is increasingly taking the form of a struggle among what the great sociologist Max Weber called status groups. That is to say, ethnicities, races, and in particular, and I don't think this is emphasized enough, the struggle between the educated and the non-educated, or the credentialed and the non-credentialed. The material meaning of these struggles, in my view, is distributional struggles, or basically rent-seeking struggles. And when we see the sort of the proliferation of this new type of politics, we are seeing a political change that is related to the change in the fundamental structure of exploitation. The third point I think that we should think about, a very important point, is that because of the new increasing importance of political mechanisms in the transfer of surplus, direct control over the state is of increasing importance for very particular groups of capitalists, which has, as a consequence, and paradoxically, an increasingly sharp political struggle within the capitalist class, which is a strategic feature of the current period that requires, in my view, theorization and strategic orientation toward. And we can see that, of course, in the kind of party struggle, the extraordinary level of partisanship in the party struggle in the United States, which is partly a matter of getting control of the state in order to appropriate the levers of redistribution for the interests of particular sectors of capital. We could just summarize that by contrasting fossil fuels with healthcare, for example. Now, the implication of that, and I think this is very important, is that how should we think about the ethnopolitics of the US, which is another theme that Conrad has written about very interestingly. I think there's a strong tendency to see there's what I call ethnopolitics and its closely related cousin, which I would call the sort of the politics of the educated or credentialed, non-credentialed. This politics has a material foundation. It is not a question of material interests versus appeals to ethnicity, race, and so-called cultural factors. Rather, the question is, can the appeal be made in terms of material interests articulated as class interests, or is it material interests articulated as ethnic interests? This is, I think, the fundamental problem that we are facing in the contemporary period. So the task of the socialist left, I think, is a very, very difficult one in the current period, because it is not enough, at least this would be my view, it is not enough to say we must appeal to the interests of workers, the material interests of workers, as over against whatever kinds of identities might divide them, separate them, or dissolve them into unsolidaristic groups. It is rather necessary to appeal to the interests of workers as a class, which is more than just material interests. It is a material interest of a group that has a specific location, obviously, in the structure of exploitation. And I think that is the big challenge of socialism in the current period. And I think it's very effectively laid out in Conrad's various writings. So thanks.
All right, thanks, Dylan. Conrad, feel free to respond. Again, we're lacking questions from the audience at this point, but anyone can speak. And if we feel like just wrapping it up, then we'll go to intermission and then have the keynote for the day. But yeah, anyone who wishes to respond, go for it.
Well, I wanted to say something about your remarks that I think I agree with quite a bit. I know there are some other talks on this at this conference that deal with the question of the professional managerial class, and I guess you called it class struggle. I maybe wouldn't use that term, but the intra-group competition between the educated masses and the sort of managerial sections of society. The thing that I've always been sort of struck by is how the pitch of these people's kind of political partialness, as it expresses itself in their professional and social lives, seems to increase as the industries that they work in get closer to the operations of the Democratic Party. Here in Oregon, it's basically a single party rule type of state. We have a sort of minority rural population. The Democrats basically run things. So there are large sections of industry, I think you sort of talked about this, that are very, very cozy with kind of, both the official apparatus and the kind of parallel ideological apparatus of the Democrats. So I think that relationship between the state, seeming political partisanship on the part of these different class strata is a kind of a key point to tease out there.
All right, we've got one question from the audience. So Samuel, if you're there now, we can allow you to speak and you can ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Or wait, I'm not repeating the question. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, we're gonna let him ask it. Sam, you there?
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Indeed.
Okay, yeah, I think you started kind of answering what I was thinking just a moment ago, but I sort of want to push you further. Can you explain what you mean by the Democratic Party? Are you thinking of the official organs that legally constitute the party, or the social groups of people that identify with it and sort of compose it demographically? And what do you see as a good way to analyze the party and its sort of workings of social power? Because I think you're pointing at something important, that political parties are sort of an institution that I haven't seen much like good socialist analysis of in the contemporary world. And what sort of power do you see the Democratic Party, in quotation marks, exercising?
Yeah, so I should say that I'm not probably the person to come to for the best socialist analysis on this exact question, but I really do view the Democrats and the Republicans to a lesser extent as a much more kind of robust and holistic social phenomenon than I think a lot of people on the left really do. You know, there's sort of this idea that, like, the DNC, it's basically a fundraising apparatus, and in strictly formal terms, that might be true. But like I said earlier, political parties in this country are sort of objectively connected through their, you know, the fact that they rule the American government, to industries, like entire industries that tend to align themselves with one party or the other, to media and academic production, and through, I mean, you could say sort of an organic culture of a certain type of intellectual activity that permeates what I referred to as kind of their cadre in my essay. I'm just thinking of, you know, politically aware people who strongly identify with one or the other, and you know, make it their duty to stay very informed about the goings on and current events that inform their party's positions. And when you add all those things up, it really is sort of a like a broad spectrum, I think would be the military term, sort of array of forces that that the party and its affiliated institutions has over American society.
Conrad, I'm wondering, I gather that we both have some background in the history of Debsian socialism and what the Second International parties looked like and the sort of tasks they undertook in various countries, including this one. And I'm wondering, in contradistinction to the contemporary Democratic Party, when you think about that history, are there any sort of models or types of undertakings that you think would be perhaps more in line with that historic vision of what Marxism meant as a party practice, as a socialist party practice? And I'm thinking in particular of the highly civil social nature of that party, right? That it had it wasn't really an electoral party with a civil social base. It was more of a civil social party with an electoral arm, which I think distinguishes it from how a lot of contemporary democratic socialists imagine the Democratic Party. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, given that there are these discontents around policing, around safety, around crime. What kind of civil social undertakings could potentially address that in the future, or abstractly from a historically socialist perspective?
So I guess I would say that this question seems to me to be extremely fraught and complicated, because, well, socialists, and, you know, call it what you like, their party, their organization, what have you, I'm, you know, very sympathetic to the idea that that should be kind of based at the civil social level and find political expression at kind of a different level. Perhaps today even more so than in kind of that Second International moment, competing social forces are trying very, very hard to organize people in competing ways. So, just, I think I've talked about this before, but, you might be a socialist, go around, do a lot of community organizing, and find within a few years that the people you're community organizing realize that they really want to get Democrats elected or something like that. I've always, so this is sort of my way of saying that I don't have a great answer to this question. The only way that I could think of getting around that is finding some way to sort of connect at every possible moment the civil social activity with socialism proper, kind of, this goal. And that has always seemed to me to be a lot easier said than done in the contemporary world. So it's really difficult to get kind of past that in my own thought, is what I would say.
All right, great. We've got another question from Joseph Staton in the Q&A. So Joseph, I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to ask your question. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, and thank you guys both so much for your papers. This question is for Conrad. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what your experience has been like trying to articulate this position to your colleagues in the DSA, or even to politically oriented friends who may not sort of share your view of the situation. Particularly curious about last summer, when sort of the perceived urgency of immediate action with respect to police violence, et cetera, was very high. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just people I know out in the normal world, I found don't usually have that much of a problem with these ideas, mostly because for a lot of people, saying that the relationship between some protests and socialism is not a straightforward one strikes them as a little bit obvious, I think. However, contrast that with avowed socialists, and it becomes a little bit more. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time complaining, but I think I've made a little bit of mention of it in the talk. I would say overwhelming hostility is basically my description of what my relationship with my socialist friends has been on this question, especially last summer, when a lot of people really did sort of think like, this is the moment. We have to capitalize on this right now. Being the person who says, like, wait, guys, maybe this isn't sort of the big opportunity that you all seem to think it is not something people want to hear.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we've got one more question in the Q&A. This is from Jim Madigan. Jim, I'm going to allow you to speak if you want to ask your question. Go ahead. Jim, you there?
Yeah, Conrad. So given the things that you've said about the Democratic Party, why has what's been called the left refused to back various electoral left formations, including the Green Party, even if it was trying to join with the idea of taking over the party to build a more worker-centered party? I'm particularly interested in the flack the 3 DSA chapters took last year for supporting the Greens in the general election.
Sure. I guess I don't have a ton of experience with the Green Party. I used to live in Corvallis, Oregon, which is a place where they sort of have a actual political presence. But I think for self-avowed socialists, dealing with the Green Party might be a little bit difficult for a few reasons. One is that, while they are an independent electoral effort, I think they only declared themselves socialists a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly, certainly after the 2016 election. The other reason is they, share a name, at least, with a lot of kind of avowedly neoliberal parties in Europe. It's sort of the same. I wouldn't necessarily, or I should say that, and you could say that would be a problem for socialist parties too, because look at the socialists in France or something like that. But for an organization like the Greens, whose kind of historical connection to socialism is a little bit more tenuous than theirs, it's probably that much more of a hurdle.
Thanks.
All right, it looks like Ed, you had a hand up. You want to speak?
I actually did. My name's Audrey.
Oh, okay, go for it.
Oh, hello, Audrey.
Hey, Conrad. My question is for Conrad, but maybe for Dylan as well. What is class consciousness today, if it's something that can be developed through the study of political economy? How does this not assume an objectivistic or sociological view of class, analogous to the so-called epistemological standpoints of race, gender, and sexuality? How would you defend your understanding of class consciousness against Lukács and the Marxist understanding of class as a historical and therefore negative category of subject-object mediated theory / practice?
Dylan, you want to give this one a shot first?
Hello. Okay. Yeah. Well, that was quite a mouth. I mean, I'll try to say something about it. Look. So you asked the question, what is class consciousness? And I guess I actually think that that in formal terms, in terms of laying out the problem, the place to start is Lukács. So I wouldn't defend my position against Lukács. I would rather try to understand and explain what his position is. What is Lukács' analysis of class consciousness? Simple. It's the consciousness of class. That is to say that the specific characteristic of class consciousness for the working class under capitalism is that it takes the form of a consciousness of class, in contradistinction to all other classes in history, and specifically in contradistinction to the owners of the major means of production, whose forms of class consciousness take the form precisely of a denial of the class character of society as a whole. First point. Second point. Class consciousness is also a matter of cognition. This is a fundamental aspect of it, which is often forgotten but never should be. That is to say, the subjective consciousness of class in the case of the working class entails, as part of its content, an understanding of the actual structure of capitalist society as a whole. This is not an extraneous matter. This is a part of what we mean by class consciousness. In other words, if one is talking about class consciousness, one is also talking about an analysis of capitalist society and of its basic structure and sort of tendencies of reproduction and transformation. Okay. Now, in terms of the question of race and gender and other categories of identification, we could say, I think it would be my own opinion about these matters is that these are not, as it were, symmetrical kind of alternatives that, are just other forms of identity along with class. That is to say that class consciousness has a different cognitive status with respect to other forms of consciousness. But that opens up a set of complex questions that, I don't know if we want to get into or we really have time to get into, but that would be my first approximation to what class consciousness is.
I guess I would say that first of all, I'm not sure that the best way to foster class consciousness in America would be to develop a thoroughgoing understanding of contemporary political economy, or at least maybe not in that order. As far as how can we, I think, and excuse me if I'm butchering the question, sort of differentiate class consciousness from kind of these other, identity formation consciousnesses that exist out there. I mean, I guess I would just say that the difference is that class consciousness would really take as its object the totality of contemporary capitalist society, and not just particular aspects of it, such that hopefully it could be changed. And I realize that's a little short and probably a little too easy to say, but I'll just leave it there.
I guess I would just add, from the perspective of intellectual history, I think Marx was very well aware of the fact that he was not the first by any means to introduce class analysis, so-called, and that his distinctive contribution rather was to theorizing proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat under capitalism. Lenin was very aware of this as well. Interestingly, there's a book called Uncertain Victory, which traces the convergence of progressive non-Marxist thought with revisionist socialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's written from a progressive non-Marxist point of view, but part of the upshot there, right, is you can see this in the work of, for example, Charles Beard, the American historian, that what is distinctive to Marxism is not class analysis, right, or a kind of materialist account or a critique of exploitation. And, from a kind of, I would say from a broadly Lukácsian point of view, you could say that what happens with the Stalinization of the left is that class as a term and the proletariat as a term becomes sort of narrowed, right? It ends up converging with this more diminished progressivist understanding as a kind of like economist, to use Lenin's term, like a kind of economist class analysis. And then and that actually sets up the epistemological framework for what we now know as, for example, intersectionality or identity politics, right? Because once class becomes reduced, once it no longer means social totality, as it did for Lukács, as Conrad correctly says, but it just means sort of economics and material exploitation, that sets up, for example, mid-20th century feminist thinkers like Gerda Lerner to come out of the Stalinist communist movement and say, okay, well, you had this narrow analysis of class, now I'm going to give you the narrow analysis of gender alongside of it, right? And so that corresponds to this kind of movement strategy, that epistemology. So I do think there's a risk of narrowing the conception of the proletariat, narrowing the conception of class in a way that just converges with progressivism. And I'll just say that, Max Shachtman, for example, the sort of a kind of originary figure behind the contemporary DSA and Michael Harrington, he was very well aware that, for example, if you read his introduction to Franz Mehring's biography of Marx, he's very well aware that he as a social democrat in the mid-20th century is adopting this sort of narrowed conception of class, right? And so I think these issues remain with us, and they've actually shaped much of the intellectual landscape of the left.
Yeah, I guess one thing that makes me think of is the raising of the economism idea. This does get bandied around quite a bit, but I think, and this is just my opinion, the important part of the applicability of this category today isn't so much, hyper focus on the economy or trade unions or something like that, and is rather, you might say, political questions that are raised in the same pamphlet, What is to be Done, by Lenin, having to do with the extent to which, a particular trade union or economic struggle, or we could say today, any other type of struggle is connected to politicizing people for the struggle for socialism. I hear this term thrown around quite a bit, sort of casually to, sort of degrade perfectly good labor militants, and it strikes me that it can probably be used to describe nearly everyone on the left.